Kirk Ferentz is seeking win 200 in his career as the head coach of the Iowa Hawkeyes. He's at 196 wins right now, and given that Iowa has had two 10-win seasons and an 8-win season and two appearances in the Big Ten championship game over the previous 3 seasons, with offenses that at best are just one spot inside the top 100, and two other offenses that were outside of the top 120, I think it's safe to say that no one is stopping Kirk Ferentz from reaching win 200 this season, especially with a schedule that is incredibly manageable. You probably thought that Iowa would now get kicked in the shin or other places several times over now that the divisions have been abolished. But no. Not at all. They avoid Oregon, they avoid Penn State, they avoid Michigan. In fact, you basically take their schedule from last season and substitute a road trip to Penn State for a road trip to Ohio State. That's basically what this schedule is. Of course, it's very different in details, but in terms of Iowa's, I guess you would call it ceiling, or the number of winnable games, very winnable games on their schedule, it's basically last year's schedule, except the auto loss on the road at Penn State is now an auto loss on the road at Ohio State. But he's getting that 200th career win. He's done it without any offense over the past 3 seasons, winning football games. And traditionally at Iowa, they have been known for their defense under Kirk Ferentz regardless. They've been more of a defensive and special teams-led team with offenses that, whether it's Brad Banks, whether it's C.J. Beathard, Nate Stanley, probably some other fair, decent, above average to good Iowa quarterbacks. I think Brad Banks was in the Heisman conversation at one point with Kirk Ferentz in Iowa in the early 2000s. They had that really good 2002 year where they just lost to Iowa State, but were undefeated in Big Ten Conference play and played USC in the Rose Bowl. They've been known for their defense, their special teams. Their defense has taken a step up under the tenure of Phil Parker, who succeeded Norm Parker. And last year's defense, the 2022 defense, were generational statistically. The fact that they, in 2022, only allowed 13.3 points per game when the offense only scored 17.7, and in 2023, they only allowed 14.8 points per game when the offense only scored 15.4, which was 132nd out of 133 FBS teams in scoring offense. They were nearly the worst scoring offense in all of college football, not just the Power Four, is very impressive. But Iowa made some changes. Really, it was by the hand of the athletic department that Brian Ferentz was fired. He's now an offensive analyst with the Maryland Terrapins, where if he's only working with the offensive line, he'll do a phenomenal job with Mike Locksley and I think help them rebuild on an offensive line that last year was a little underwhelming and lost several key players entering 2024. But as an offensive coordinator, he was a disaster. And Tim Lester, former Western Michigan head coach, who commanded some pretty impressive offenses there with the Broncos, he was hired as the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach. And Kirk Ferentz said at media days that he thinks Iowa has the potential to be good offensively. I don't know if he's lying or not, but I think Iowa certainly has the potential to improve at least a little, if not a lot, offensively. And if they improve significantly on offense and the defense further improves from last season, I'm telling you right now, Iowa is certainly a college football playoff contender to make it. And if Ferentz isn't lying about the offense potentially being good, which we'll have to see, I have a lot of skepticism about that statement, but then Iowa, I would say, would be a legitimate top 10 team if they had a good offense with this defense and special teams. Before we continue into this video, though, and talk about the expectations for Iowa's season, and I do a deep dive on their schedule, their roster, their X-factor position on this team, their best position, their strengths, weaknesses, everything you need to know about Iowa football. Before we get into that, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this video around to other Iowa football fans or college football fans so we can grow the community to 20,000 subscribers, where I will be doing a giveaway. And the first video that I've published this season that we get to 1,000 likes, and I think we'll definitely get one of those videos, if not a few, in the regular season, there will also be a giveaway. So there are 2 giveaways awaiting for you if you just subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell as well, so that you can get notified when those giveaways occur, when any new college football content releases. And liking the video helps this channel get into the algorithm, get more viewers, earn more dollars, which helps fund the show and make this awesome content. Just do all those things. It won't take that much time. It'll be worth it and beneficial to us. So let's dive back in and talk about the expectations, because that's really the only place where we can begin before we get into the schedule and the roster. The schedule and the roster really help determine if the expectations, how likely they are to be met. Obviously, we want to be realistic on here. I'm not going to tell you that Iowa expects to go 12-0, or they expect to win the Big Ten or the national championship. We have realistic expectations that are in part determined by the schedule and the roster, but the schedule, I hope I'm making sense in saying that they're tied together, but they're not tied at the hip necessarily. An example of this is Penn State. Penn State last year, the expectation should be, well, beat one of Ohio State or Michigan, and they didn't do it. And that was because when you looked at their roster, it was unlikely. And I read that in the 2023 preseason. By read it, I mean I saw it, and I'm like, oh, I think this is pretty obvious. So Iowa, I think the expectation for them should be 10-2 or 11-1 in the regular season with the schedule they have and the previous 3 years that they have under their belt. And I pick that number, and next season it will probably be 4 because, freshmen, sophomore, junior, senior players are at a program for typically 4 to 5 years. I know this is the transfer portal era, but there are still going to be plenty of players who stay with their team. You also have to factor in incoming transfers who can stay for several years or just a season. There's typically a lot of coaching turnover that happens within half a decade, 4 years, 3 years. And I would have put 2020 up here, but COVID was weird in a lot of ways and affected a lot of programs more negatively than just the simple production losses they had entering the 2020 season. So while I count the results of 2020, and Iowa actually had a really good team at the end of 2020, I am ultimately not going to put them up here, especially because the wins and losses look weird in the wins and loss column because the Big Ten only had a 10-game schedule. Several programs didn't even play the full 10 games. But for Iowa, I think they have a fair enough schedule, a good enough roster, and really they've just performed well enough over the previous 3 seasons to where you should expect 10-2, which Iowa achieved in 2021 and 2023, and with a new offensive coordinator, and with Iowa being 9th in returning production, well, you should expect 11-1. I don't think 10-2 would be a failure. I don't even think it would be a disappointment given the caliber of team Iowa is. They won a ton of close games last year, and when you win that many close games, you're either very lucky, and lucky not as in you didn't earn it, but close games, the ball can easily bounce the other way. I think 2022 TCU was very much like this, and 2023 proved it when they lost a bunch of close games. Or you're like Washington over the previous 2 seasons in 2022 or 2023, where you're consistently good at winning close games, also like Mark D'Antonio Michigan State teams. And Iowa last year, I think, falls into that category a bit, but you never want to rely on winning several close games over and over again. So Iowa could be much better this year at 10-2 than they were last year at 10-2, but still have the same record. 11-1 I just put up there because this team should be better than last year's team, and if they're going to be an improvement over a 10-2 team, I think 11-1 is also a reasonable expectation. I think 9-3 or worse would be disappointing/failure. 10-2 would be, well, a good team. And Iowa's goal, I don't think, relates to you have to make the college football playoff or the season's a failure. We're beyond that point in these Big Ten preview videos now, because Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State, we've already done. But I think Iowa would love to make the college football playoff with the schedule they have, with what they have returning, and it's possible. So I'm not going to put non-applicable for desired college football playoff wins. I think a goal of Iowa's, although it's an extra, is to make the playoff. I think that's very realistic, and I think that's a fair expectation for this team. But let's check out the schedule so I can really show you what I mean by this is easy. I mean, literally, take last year's schedule, substitute Penn State for Ohio State, and that is basically this year's schedule if you want to look at games that Iowa can easily win and games that will be nearly impossible to win. In retrospect, last year's matchup at Penn State would have been nearly impossible to win. I didn't necessarily think that in the 2023 preseason, but when you turn over the ball a bunch of times and Drew Aller has a very successful day against you and it's a whiteout game and the final score is 31-0, you were not winning that game, even once in a 10, 15, or 20 game series. But Iowa's schedule, look at it. Week 1, Illinois State. Week 2, Iowa State at home. Week 3, Troy. 3 home games in a row, all non-conference. First road trip of the season is the Big Ten Conference opener at Minnesota in Week 4. Iowa gets a bye in Week 5 to prepare for the road trip to Ohio State in Week 6. Washington comes to town in Week 7. Iowa travels at Michigan State in Week 8. Michigan State gets a bye before their matchup with Iowa, so that's a game to pay attention to. Like Iowa, Michigan State will be well coached, and they will play to their talent ceiling. Northwestern is a home game in Week 9. Wisconsin's a home game in Week 10. That could be interesting. Although I think it's kind of a weird spot for Wisconsin as they play Penn State the prior week at home, and I think it's going to be a letdown spot in Kinnick in Week 10 for Wisconsin. But at UCLA in Week 11, with just the distance of travel and the fact that it's in November, so it'll probably be a little warmer than Iowa might be used to, and Iowa's a team that is, even if they're really good, and by really good I mean top 20, even top 15, and I think they're going to be in that range, they're probably 99.9% sure not going to have the offensive firepower to just overwhelm teams and blow them out. So a UCLA team that does have talent, particularly in the trenches and at running back, could play Iowa close. That's an interesting game. Iowa gets a bye in Week 12, which I think is well-timed because they have to travel at Maryland in Week 13. And more importantly, they have to host rival Nebraska in the Heroes game in Week 14. And it will be a night game on Friday, which is something that I really like. They didn't change the tradition enough in the sense that, like, they didn't move it to Saturday. And by changing it enough, I mean change it enough to where you ruin it or where you upset people. But they tweaked it, I think, to that sweet spot where we get a Kinnick Stadium night game, which is a privilege. It's one of the best environments in college football, especially for ranked matchups. And I do think Nebraska-Iowa this season will be a ranked matchup. In fact, I think they may be fighting for a playoff spot in that game because Nebraska's schedule is also workable, and I also think they will be a top 20, top 25 team. Iowa returns 79% of their production, and 17 starters come back. Those are jarring numbers. They lead the Big Ten in those categories, and they're behind rival Iowa State, Oklahoma State, a little behind Virginia Tech. They're behind Rice. Those are just a few teams I can name. In the returning production top 10, Iowa last season, whether it was them or Oklahoma State or Iowa State, they were power rated about the same, finished similar. And those are probably the best teams in the top 10 of returning production, if my memory serves me correctly. But Iowa bringing back the majority of their defense, outside of Cooper DeJean and a few defensive linemen, but Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson were some of the best players in college football last year on defense. They're back. Deontay Craig is back. Xavier Nwampka is back. Quinn Schulte, Sebastian Castro are back. And the offensive line, particularly on the interior, is returning as well. Same with tight end Luke Lachey, who was injured for much of last season. I think that Iowa, as I talked about earlier, expectations, even reasonable expectations, I'm not always going to predict a team to fulfill, or at times even have the potential to fulfill what I think are reasonable expectations. A prime example of this would have been my prediction in both 2022 and 2023 that Jimbo Fisher and Texas A&M would only get 7 or 8 wins. And given the talent they had, that would not even fulfill what I would call reasonable expectations. But because I didn't view Jimbo Fisher as a good head coach, and they had some holes in their roster, particularly because of the bad coaching, I didn't think they could meet reasonable expectations. For Iowa, that's been the case on offense. Like, the 2022 season was honestly disappointing, given that they returned Jack Campbell, they brought back a lot of defensive players, and they even returned some players on offense, and Caleb Johnson broke out to finish the season. And Petrus came back, and they got that much worse on the offensive side of the football. I think Iowa, given how much they return, can fulfill the reasonable expectation I've set for them. And in fact, I think they can reach their peak. Their peak being 11-1, making the college football playoff, and depending on how round 1 goes, maybe they can win a playoff game, depending on how good Iowa is offensively. And let's say maybe Iowa at 11-1, they probably don't get into the 5 or 6 spot, but maybe they can get into that 8 spot, or maybe the 7th spot if there's a lot of upsets. And Iowa hosting a college football playoff game would give them a tremendous advantage because they're going to be used to the cold weather that most other teams will not be used to. And they have a loud crowd, loud stadium, a great defense, good special teams. They absolutely have the returning production, the coaching staff, the overall roster, the talent that's been assembled, and the experience to reach their peak. And they also have the strength and conditioning. They have the head coach in Kirk Ferentz. I really love Iowa's defense. I think it's going to be the best defense in college football. I've been saying that for a while now, several weeks. And I like to wait until we get closer to the end of the preseason to make definitive predictions. And that's one of mine that I'm very adamant about, is Iowa is going to have the nation's best defense. It won't be Ohio State. It won't be Michigan. It will not be Penn State. It will not be Oregon or Georgia or Florida State or Clemson or Nebraska or Notre Dame or Oklahoma. It will be Iowa. And if Iowa has any type of offense this season, I think it won't even be close, because this defense, which has been used to being on the field forever and having to carry the game for the offense for the previous 3 seasons, imagine what they'll be like if they actually get an offense. They can take more risks. They can intercept the football rather than just having to make it safe and deflect it. Or they can send more pressure forward. They can be more aggressive rather than having to be safe. On the defensive line, Yahya Black comes back. Aaron Graves is ready to step up. Deontay Craig and Ethan Hurkett, I think, are going to bring it to opposing quarterbacks. At linebacker, Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson are some of the country's best. Jay Higgins nearly had 200 total tackles last season. And at defensive back, Sebastian Castro, Quinn Schulte, Xavier Nwapka, John Nestor, Deshaun Lee, and Jermani Harris. That's a deep secondary room. It's one of the best secondaries in all of college football. And on the interior of the offensive line, I look at Iowa's Logan Jones, their center, and they return many other offensive linemen. The offensive line has not exactly been a strength, even with favorable returning production or recruiting. But I think that with how much experience they have back this season, and they did add some transfers there, I think they'll be strong on the interior. And at tight end, you got Luke Lachey back, same with Addison Ostrenga. I think this room is going to reload, and if healthy, it'll be one of the best tight end rooms in the country. The passing defense is this team's strength. Their weakness is obviously quarterback. Cade McNamara and Brennan Sullivan have a lot of questions to answer. Same with a wide receiver room that was just lacking last season. Really, it's overall skill position play. Running back last year was, I'd say, disappointing, mainly because of injuries, though, so I'm not going to hold that against the coaching staff or the roster. And it was the same thing with tight end, unfortunately, due to injuries. I think that really the offense is the storyline. And whether Tim Lester can fix this unit at all or not, I think they have enough personnel to where they could have a good defense, good offense, rather. Sometimes Iowa's offense is their defense anyway, with the pick sixes, same with the special teams and punt and kick returns. They could have a good gosh, I keep messing that up. They could have a good offense for Iowa standards, which I think could be an average or maybe at its ceiling above average offense in college football. That paired with the defense that they have and the special teams unit would be lethal. It would produce, I think, the best Iowa team since the 2000s Iowa's team that could actually consistently score points and dominate opponents. It could even be better than the 2015 Iowa team, which really just got through a very easy schedule, played in a bunch of close games, and then you saw really who they were in that Rose Bowl game against Stanford and how inferior they were to many other teams with a similar record. I think Iowa goes 11-2, 8-1 in Big Ten Conference play with a ceiling of 11-1 and a floor of 8-4. If Kirk Ferentz isn't lying, this team's ceiling is truly 12-0, even though I think the Ohio State game's basically an auto loss, because an Iowa team with a good offense and the defense and special teams they have could have a shot to probably beat anyone in the country, but I'm not buying that for now. I'm honestly going to have to wait and see on that one. And I don't think that prediction will come true. But they'll beat Illinois State, Iowa State, Troy, at Minnesota. They'll lose on the road to Ohio State, but could play them competitively. They'll beat Washington, Michigan State, Northwestern, Wisconsin, UCLA, Maryland, and Nebraska. I think they'll reach the college football playoff, but I do think because many good teams this season have an easy schedule, I think that the good teams are going to be empowered by these mega conferences, as we've seen before with teams when they begin to lose, when pressure comes on, and especially when coaches are fired, sometimes there's just this massive exodus on the roster. I think that could create some more free wins than some are anticipating this season. So I think an 11-1 Iowa won't host a playoff game. They'll lose at Penn State in round one, but overall have a very successful season. And part of the reason I think they'll have an extremely successful season is their returning production numbers. They bring back 86% of their defensive production alone. That last year was a top 4, top 5 defense, and they bring back nearly 9/10 of their tackles, their sacks, their tackles for loss, their passes defended, their interceptions, their forced fumbles, fumble recoveries, etc. They're very, very good, Iowa's defense is. And returning as much as they do, I think is going to benefit this team and give them success. Tim Lester has replaced Brian Ferentz as offensive coordinator. That's another reason why I think that Iowa will have success this season. I think this offense will get some much-needed juice, and I think you'll see the improvements particularly at quarterback. In fact, I know that Cade McNamara did not look good in an open practice, but they do have Brennan Sullivan, so I think McNamara would be benched and replaced by Sullivan if he is that terrible in the regular season. At wide receiver, there could be some players that do end up stepping up, but again, we'll have to wait and see on that. The Hawkeyes will have their best offensive line and running back room as well since the 2020 and 2021 seasons. And I'm talking about Tyler Goodson. I'm talking about the All-American center, Tyler Linderbaum, who was their starting center in 2020 and 2021. And Tyler Goodson, I think, was a first-team All-Big Ten running back in 2020, second or third team in 2021. Caleb Johnson comes back, same with LaShawn Williams, and Kamari Moulton returns. That's a deep running back room if they can stay healthy. And at the offensive line, you have Connor Colby, you have Logan Jones, you have other players too. And they brought in a North Dakota State transfer. Last year they were willing to use the transfer portal, bringing in Dejon Parker in the interior of the offensive line or offensive tackle. They're starting 5 this season. All of them except for 2 players are redshirt seniors or just seniors. The other 2 are redshirt juniors. Mason Richmond and Jennings Ducker are the projected starting tackles. Bo Steffens and Connor Colby are the projected starting guards. And Logan Jones is the projected starting center. Tyler Ellsbury is backing up Jones at center. He's also a redshirt senior. Nick DeJong is a graduate guard. And I think looking at this offensive line, they may not be great like some offensive lines for Iowa in the past, but they'll be good. And they have had an average offensive line at best in 2022 and 2023. In fact, I think those offensive lines are just bad. The 2021 offensive line was literally carried by Tyler Linderbaum. And I think this offensive line will be potentially one of the Big Ten's better units, which means it would be one of the nation's better offensive lines. It has that type of potential. And at running back, I don't have an Iowa running back on my all Big Ten player teams, but I do think they have substantial depth there. And if the offensive line is good, that's more important. If you have elite running backs, let's take a case study here in Kenneth Walker at Michigan State. Even with Kenneth Walker, when his offensive line, when the injuries started piling up, and it was just about an average, above average O-line, it wasn't bad. Even with an average, above average unit with an elite running back, against Ohio State, where there was a talent mismatch, and against, I mean, dare I say it, even against Michigan without the 5 big runs that he got, which were all him, what did he do? And I love Kenneth Walker, and I think he's an elite running back, and he's good in the NFL. My point there wasn't to trash him at all, and maybe that came out wrong, but you would rather than Kenneth Walker and Michigan State's offensive line, you would rather have Georgia's offensive line in 2021 with Zamir White and James Cook, even though Kenneth Walker is a far better running back than either of those two. Because of the offensive line, you would have a more consistent rushing attack. So it's more important to have a better offensive line than a better running back room. It just is. And S&P Plus will even tell you that because they give more weight to returning production stats on the offensive line for offense than at running back. And that's not just because the offensive line has 5 times the amount of players that the starting running backs do typically, though sometimes it's only 2.5 times more because 2 running back sets, but because the offensive line is more important. Iowa could be worse than I anticipate, though. I could be wrong if the offense is so damaged that they cannot improve in one season. Like if they have an offense that once again is outside of the top 120. And the reason I say that I could be wrong if that's the case, because I could also be right if Iowa just wins several close games again, is it's hard to win several close games. And with Minnesota improving, Nebraska improving, Michigan State improving, Washington will have a similar level of talent on their roster that Iowa does in terms of recruiting rankings, and they will have a good head coach in Jed Fish. Maybe Iowa drops a few more games than they did last season, just by virtue of the fact that winning close games is very hard. My All-Americans on Iowa's team are linebacker Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson, Xavier Nwapka, Sebastian Castro, Yaya Black, and Quinn Schulte. That is 6 All-Americans that I have for the Iowa Hawkeyes. All of them on defense. Some other All-Big Ten players are Logan Jones, Deontay Craig, Drew Stevens, Caden Wetjen, Connor Colby, Luke Lachey, Aaron Graves, Ethan Herkett, Deshaun Lee, and Rice Decken. Those are some other players that I have for Iowa on their All-Big Ten team. And most importantly, I want to zoom in on Iowa's linebackers because I think their X factor is linebacker play. The linebacker is the quarterback of the defense, and Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson managed Iowa's defense incredibly well under the command of Phil Parker. Last season, Iowa was 3rd in opponent offensive points allowed per game, only allowing 13.7. They were 3rd in opponent points per play, only allowing 0.207. They were 1st in opponent yards per play, and this was with a defense that was on the field for a few minutes over 30 minutes per game. They only allowed 3.9 yards per play. Now, They played some pretty terrible offenses being in the Big Ten West, but they played Penn State, they played Michigan, and Tennessee. Penn State in the regular season, Michigan in the Big Ten championship game, and Tennessee in the Citrus Bowl. All of those teams did have top 25 offenses, Michigan's being top 5 in efficiency, and then Penn State's and Tennessee's being inside the top 25. They performed very admirably against Michigan. I would even say against Penn State, given all the turnovers and the fact that their offense literally did nothing. Tennessee was a bit of an embarrassment, but I think that is more of a credit to Nico Iamaleava being an amazing playmaker. This defense was one of the country's best last season. I'll say it again. They were 5th in opponent yards per game allowed, only allowing 281.9 yards per game, and they were 3rd in offensive touchdowns allowed per game, only allowing 1.3 per game. Players who will make or break the season. Honestly, I would look at Cade McNamara. He completed only 51.1% of his passes last year, threw for 505 yards, 4 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, averaged 5.6 yards per pass attempt, and he had a 106.2 passer rating. Now, for last season, when he played in the 5 games that he played, Utah State, Iowa State, Western Michigan, Penn State, and also Michigan State, he was not healthy. He had a injured quad, and then he went down, I think, tearing his Achilles or his ACL, one of the two, in September 30th against Michigan State, or on September 30th against Michigan State. It's important that he can put together a stat line that he had in 2021, or even in 2020. In 2020, he only completed 60.6% of his passes, threw for 425 yards, 6 yards per pass attempt, and 5 touchdowns. In 2021, he threw for 15 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 8 yards per pass attempt, 2,470 yards, and he completed about 64.6% of his passes and finished with a 145.4 passer rating. If he can put together anywhere from a 130 to 150 passer rating and have a 3-to-1 TDINT ratio or better, and completes anywhere from 60 to 65% of his passes, Iowa's offense will definitely be top 100 given all that they return on the O-line, running back, tight end, and the upgrades that they should make at wide receiver given what they have coming back there, some incoming transfers, and also young players who could step up. I mean, Iowa's wide receiver unit was exceptionally bad last season. Another player who will make or break the season for the Hawkeyes, I think, will be running back LaShawn Williams and Caleb Johnson. LaShawn Williams at 821 rushing yards, Caleb Johnson at 463. Williams averaged 4.8 yards per carry and had 1 rushing touchdown. Johnson averaged 4 yards per carry and only had 3 rushing touchdowns. If they can bump up their yards per carry numbers and get in the end zone more, that will be critical for offensive success. And last but not least, I'd say, is Drew Stevens. The defense, is going to be good, so I don't think there's a player who will make or break the season on defense. On defense, Iowa will only have players that honestly make the season better because they're all that good. Drew Stevens was 19 of 20 on extra points last year. He only made 69% of his field goals, going 18 of 26. He needs to be a more accurate kicker this season for Iowa to maximize their chances to win. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Braska Rascal for sponsoring this video as Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connor Little, OH, and Ismar for sponsoring this video and channel as All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for sponsoring this video and channel as all-conference members. Thank you very much for your support. And if you want to support the channel and have your name featured at the end of every video, sign up as a Patreon member via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. If you want to wear the comfortable clothing that I was wearing today and represent college football with Sam, check out my merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. We have T-shirts, only T-shirts. Maybe in the future I'll do sweaters, but we have T-shirts for every Big Ten school theme, all 18 of them. So if you want to represent your Big Ten team or just represent the channel with a black or white T-shirt, long sleeve shirt, or sweater, purchase merchandise on the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.